All right, there we go. And we're just making sure that we're actually the on the right place. And we are posting this to the right group of Chosen Family Church. Hello, friends. We really appreciate you being here. I hope that you will enjoy the little service that we have going on today, our worship service here with Chosen Family Church, which is a wonderful community of queer folks all over the place. And so I have to share my screen so you can see the PowerPoint, because I always forget to do that. And the PowerPoint is over here. And gonna have the PowerPoint up in just a minute. Hey, James, thank you for joining us. All right, and we have Chosen Family Church. That's all right. There we go. And my apologies, friends. We normally have more people here who help me, so I unfortunately just on myself today. And so trying to make sure it works. Welcome, Chosen Family Church. We are so glad that you are with us today. Sorry, let me try that one more time. Welcome to Chosen Family Church. We are so glad that you are with us today on the first Sunday of Lent. Today, if you're in the chat, go ahead and keep your microphone muted and have a video if you'd like. Put your names and pronouns in the chat. And if you're following along later, go ahead and put your name in the chat. Leave us a comment. Talk to us about how you were here and use that chat bar for fellowship. The order of service, we're going to have a land acknowledgement, a statement of faith, opening prayers. We have 4 scripture readings today and then a sermon on the waters of baptism. And we will be remembering our baptism today. So please have a small bit of water nearby so you can remember your baptism. Then our benediction and time for fellowship. Land acknowledgement. We acknowledge this meeting as being led on the traditional home of Indigenous peoples, including the Catawba, Waxhaw, Chirrah, and Sugaree people. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We also take a moment to acknowledge the prominent role that the Church has displayed in the historical and continued oppression and genocide of Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge our own personal shortcomings, racism, ignorance, compliance, and microaggressions. We pledge to do better with our words, our actions, our votes, and our dollars. We believe all peoples of all genders and sexualities are lovingly and intentionally created by God and welcome and fully accepted just as they are. Join me. Give us grace, O Lord, to enter into the sacrament of baptism and emerge as a new creation, ready to create the divine reign with you in the earth you are remaking. Amen. Hey, Beck, would you mind reading for me? I'm gonna take that as a no. Genesis 9:8-17. God said to Noah and his sons with him, I am now setting up my covenant with you, with your descendants, and with every living being with you, with the birds, with the large animals, and the animals of heaven, but with all the animals of the earth, leaving the ark with you. I will set up my covenant with you, so never again will all life be cut off by floodwaters. There will never again be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the symbol of the covenant that I am drawing up between me and you, and every living thing with you, on behalf of every future generation. I have placed my bow in the clouds. It will be the symbol of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember the covenant between me and you, and every living being among all the creatures. Floodwaters will never again destroy all creatures. The bow will be in the clouds, and upon seeing it, I will remember the enduring covenant between God and the living beings of all, and every living being of all the earth's creatures. God said to Noah, this is a symbol of the covenant that I have set up between me and all creatures on earth. The second reading is Psalm 25, 1-10. I offer my life to you, Lord. My God, I trust you. Please don't let me be put to shame. Don't let my enemies rejoice over me. For that matter, don't let anyone who hopes in you be put to shame. Instead, let those who are treacherous without excuse be put to shame. Make your ways known to me, Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth. Teach it to me, because you are the God who saves me. I put my hope in you all day long. Lord, remember your compassion and faithful love. They are forever. But don't remember the sins of my youth or my wrongdoing. Remember me only according to your faithful love for the sake of your goodness, Lord. The Lord is good and does the right thing. God teaches sinners which way they should go. God guides the weak to justice, teaching them God's way. All the Lord's paths are loving and faithful for those who keep God's covenant and laws. Our third reading comes from 1 Peter chapter 3, 18 through 22. Christ himself suffered on account of sins, once for all, the righteous one on behalf of the unrighteous. He did this in order to bring you into the presence of God. Christ was put to death as a human, but made alive by the Spirit, and it was by the Spirit that he went to preach to the spirits in prison. In the past, these spirits were disobedient when God patiently waited during the time of Noah. Noah built an ark in which a few, that is, 8 lives, were rescued through water. Baptism is like that. It saves you now, not because it removes dirt from your body, but because it is the mark of a good conscience toward God. Your salvation comes through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at God's right side. Now that he has gone into heaven, he rules over all angels, authorities, and powers. And our final reading today comes from Mark 1, verse 9 through 15. About that time, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, and John baptized him in the Jordan River. While he was coming up out of the water, Jesus saw heaven splitting open and the Spirit like a dove coming down on him. And there was a voice from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I dearly love. In you I find happiness." At once the Spirit forced Jesus out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan. He was among the wild animals, and the angels took care of him. After John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee, announcing God's good news, saying, "Now is the time. Here comes the divine reign. Change your hearts and lives and trust this good news." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Today's sermon is called The Waters of Baptism. If I can ever find where it is. The meditation of my heart, pleasing to you, O God. If you have kept up with your church calendar, you probably know that today is the first Sunday in the season of Lent. For those of us who were raised without a good understanding of Lent, we might primarily think of it as a time to try, and inevitably fail, to give up chocolate, or pray more often, or do a little fasting. But the purpose of Lent is to help our whole selves prepare ourselves to celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus. We usually give something up so that we become aware of our bodies, because Jesus' death happened to a real human body. We usually take up something so that we become aware of our souls, because Jesus' death happened to a real human soul. So why does the first story of Lent revolve around baptism? What does water have to do with death in the ancient Israelite mind? And how do we connect the ashes on our forehead on Wednesday, reminding us that we are but dust, with the water on our forehead on Sunday, reminding us of our rebirth in who God is? Well, let me tell you a couple of stories. A retelling from the lost story of Tzedek Telebob. Tzedek Telebob, known to our friends as Tzedek, because I'm not going to say that a million times in this, had always known her in-laws were a bit of a quacky bunch. While her family had made a respectable business fashioning bows and arrows for the perpetual wars going on around them, her husband Shem and his family, led by an oddball called Noah, had been sheep herders and simple builders for as long as she could remember. They were always being robbed and taken advantage of, with their flocks being separated from them as they ran about trying to put out the fires some cheeky warlord had set on their barns. Said his family had allowed her to marry the silly man because they worshipped a warrior god who wielded a bow. But despite that promise of the divine right of self defense, said his silly father in law always took this abuse lying down. They will be more sheep, Noah would always say, but there won't be another human just like them. Even as those same humans killed each other less than a mile away. Noah had got it into his head that the family needed to gather together as many different kinds of animals as they could and start building a barn that could float in the water. They traded away everything they had to pursue this wild fantasy, all but 7 of the sheep, all but 2 of the camels, and all of the riches Sede had inherited from the armor business gone, so that Noah could accumulate a mating pair of every kind of animal and a couple of extras to be eaten while they were floating on this ridiculous barn. They were nowhere near water, and at least for the purpose of this story, no one had ever seen rain before, so it seemed especially strange. Noah was so focused on the creation of this thing he called an ark that he scarcely noticed when Shem told him Sede was pregnant. In anger, Sede screamed at Noah, "Will the gods make water fall down from the sky to wash your barn into the ocean?" Noah simply bent down to pick up another pair of dogs. As if she was an oracle of the gods, the water soon began to fall from the sky. The people killing each other in the field suddenly stopped as they experienced rain falling on them for the first time. Sede asked in a whisper, "What have we done to deserve water from the heavens?" Noah responded with a stillness that turned the chaos of the animals rushing into the barn nearly silent. "Behold the tears God shed for what we have done to one another." Sede ran into the ark with her husband, terrified at the proclamation. She prayed to the gods for mercy, but still the water fell. She felt for the first time water slosh under the earth as it lifted from its place. The animals shook back and forth in the turbulence and huddled together in fear of the sound of rain knocking against the roof. The rain continued on for days, and days turned to weeks, and weeks turned into a month. Sede awoke one day, was almost disturbed to no longer hear the constant pounding of water against wood above her head. It would be another 5 months before the water subsided, during which time Sede found herself about to give birth. When her water broke, she heard water hit the wood for the first time in several months, and her mind turned toward the god who seemed to let her water break to give birth to this new kind of world. Sede gave birth to a baby girl and named her Eden, after the garden her husband's people had once lived in. Sede took baby Eden outside to look at the sky and saw a great band of colors across the horizon, as if the warrior god of Shem's family had placed it there in Eden's honor. Noah found them there, staring at the bright colors. "It's called a rainbow," he explained, "and it is God's sign that God will not use the rain to drown out chaos with chaos again." This is the reimagined word of the Lord. Thank God for our imaginations. The story of the flood, while making for a compelling story for a children's book, is a difficult one for people trying to understand who God is throughout the Bible. God had just made humanity, just called us good, and just a few chapters later, God is exterminating all of humanity. The earliest interpreters we have access to have explained that since Cain murdered Abel, there began a cycle of violence that ripped God's heart in two for us. Humans began to create weapons of war and kill each other in mass, with an entire economy coming to depend on this military industrial complex. This violence is evidenced by Cain's descendant Lamech declaring in Genesis 4:23-24, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me." If Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech is avenged 77fold. If you so much as looked at Lamech the wrong way, you could be subject to incredible retaliatory violence. This story, of course, is totally foreign to us today, as long as you ignore what America and Israel are doing to Palestine, of course. Humanity's inhumanity toward one another, we are told, grieved God so greatly that God wished God had never created us. And so God found the few people who seemed to be committed to something other than killing each other, gathered them together with enough animals to eat and repopulate the earth, and this myth's internal logic, and saved them to reset the cycle. God, known to God's earliest people as Yahweh, the warrior God with a great bow to defeat all of his, yes, his enemies, here has become God. The character imbued with feminine and masculine imagery, so great that God gives up God's bow in hopes that this final act of violence will end the cycle. Unfortunately, as we know, this grand reset does not solve the problem. Death brings on the water, which brings about the death of the people, but death does not stop death. The people of God will continue to suffer at the hands of warmongers until God's self, shows up to free them. But that brings me to another story. A retelling of the lost story of Mala. Mala was just a little girl when her family was finally released from the bonds of slavery. Mala helped helped her parents carry off the gold and silver the Egyptians had given them as an early form of reparations and wandered into the desert. Always a curious and headstrong girl, she found her way to the front of the caravan close enough to see Moses' concerned face as they approached the Red Sea. He looked across the water, then back at his people, only to shrug his shoulders and sit down, hoping beyond hope to hear God. When rumors started that the pillar of dust growing behind them was not God, but Pharaoh coming to reclaim his lost slaves, Mala watched as Moses began to sweat. The people began to scream at Moses, "It would have been better for us to die in Egypt than out here in the desert. Think of the children. Why would you do this to us?" Moses' face turned from them and locked in with Mala's eyes. Suddenly determined, he left the people and stood above the water. Raising up his staff, Mala heard Moses whisper, "God, please make this work." When Moses slammed down the staff, to everyone's amazement, including Moses, the sea suddenly dried up. Walls of water stood on either side as the people stood like a wall, unmoving, not believing what they saw before them. The bearded figure turned to them and said, "Fly, you fools." The people picked up their children and fled across the dry land, hoping beyond hope that whatever held the water at bay would hold. Moses stayed behind, watching the cloud of dust grow behind them, with Mala at his side. Soon Mala could see the figures of chariots and riders coming at them at breakneck speed. Moses scooped her up and ran as fast as the old man could across the sea, not looking back until an arrow fell at his heel. Mala watched as the chariots grew closer and closer until the Pharaoh himself seemed about to reach out and grab her. As Moses and Mala found themselves on the other side, Moses turned, slammed down his staff, and screamed, "You shall not pass!" The water slammed down against one another on top of the enemy forces, turning the Hebrews' almost certain death over into a total victory over their enemies. 4 decades later, Mala now stood at another river that seemed impossible to traverse. The time since had not been easy for her. Mala had helped her mother through a number of difficult pregnancies, which resulted in 5 daughters, but no sons to support them. She herself had been married to a wonderful foreign man who had died before she had given birth to another little girl. She had spent her entire life of hardship waiting to stand on this riverbank, always telling her sisters about the beauty of the land to come. The food there will come so easily, it will be like we are babies, she told them. And no more will we work just to survive. When her mother died, Mala was devastated, but she kept going because of the vision of the future she had held on to. Just as she had once stood at the banks of the Red Sea, now she stood at the banks of the River Jordan, with the promised land in sight. "You don't know what to do you?" she quietly asked Joshua, as he stood staring at the water. They had been camped here for several days, as scouts searched in either direction for a clear way across. They had arrived in early spring, just as the ice on the hills and mountains melted away and swelled the river far beyond its banks. Food was running low, and everyone was itching to get to the other side to take their homeland from the people living there now. Joshua looked at Mala, known for her direct conversation, and shrugged his shoulders, reminding her of Moses so many years before. Mala offered, "Want in on a little secret?" Neither did he. Joshua laughed, then tried to explain that of course Moses knew what he was doing. but that he had God on his right shoulder, easily telling him what to do. And once Joshua eliminated all those pesky outsiders trying to keep the people from their land, well, God would come and sit on Joshua's shoulder as well. Before he could really formulate the thought, Mala continued. See, I figure that Moses' special power came from the fact that he was a Levite. They're the ones who seem to know the kind of things that God likes. At least someone does, Joshua thought to himself. Mala went on, so go get the priests and that ark thing Moses made to hold God's stuff. If those things lead us into battle, we'll have to defeat all of our enemies, just like God wiped out the Egyptians. The thought made sense to Joshua, so he went ahead and did as she instructed. Sure enough, Mala's prediction was right. As soon as the priests entered the Jordan with the Ark of the Covenant, it was like the river knew the ground was too holy for mere water to be washing over it. The sea split, just as it had for Moses. And now Joshua thought it would slam down once again on Israel's enemies. This is the reimagined word of the Lord. Thank God for our imaginations. These two stories of crossing a body of water by God's divine grace illustrate more ways that water is used as part of a cycle of death and destruction. At the Red Sea, the Egyptians are coming to kill the Hebrew people for escaping with their wealth, both in gold and silver, but also in human beings. God interrupts this plan by allowing the water to provide a safe passage for the Hebrews, but utter destruction upon the Egyptians as they attempt to pass through. All of the plagues that had gotten the Hebrews free in the first place were really direct assaults on the gods of Egypt, attacking Heki the Nile god with the water turning to blood, Isis the medicine goddess with the boils, and Ra the sun god with 3 days of total darkness, just to name the 3 most notable. But this latest assault took out even the living god of the Egyptians by directly finishing off Pharaoh himself, leaving his body somewhere in the depths of the water, unable to be buried in their traditional manner, and thus unable to attain that godship. In this story, death is defeated by death through the water. The turn in Joshua is then rather concerning, as the Hebrews go from being an oppressed people in Egypt to now seeking to oppress others in Canaan. Crossing the Jordan is a return to the promised land, yes, but the people go there imagining that they will replace rather than join the people already living there. Now, this story is a fiction. Like the flood before it, the people that are supposedly eliminated in Joshua continue to show up as characters and in histories long after the Israelites' supposed total victory. And in actuality, the Hebrew people were probably simply a group of people who shared similar stories and language, just like they had supposedly eliminated, that formed together to become the Kingdom of Israel, at least for a little while. The history doesn't bear out any form of genocide actually happening. But here in the story, the water moves out of the way to allow for more death rather than life that was awaiting the people of God there. The people expected conquest, and so they conquered, and killed those different from themselves. The lack of a home that can feel like it's killing us leads the people across the water and into a life filled with death, rather than the life they were called to live. But then there's the story of Jesus. The people are expecting the Messiah, the new Joshua, to be the kind of leader who splits the seas so that he can enter in and destroy their enemies. The people remember how God utterly destroys the wicked warmongers with the flood and expect their Messiah to pluck God's bow out of the sky to fire the arrows of heaven down upon the Romans' heads. But instead of entering into the cycle of death, Jesus enters into the waters of baptism conducted by his cousin John. So, it's one more story. A retelling of the lost story of Mary. Mary had always known that Jesus was going to be different. He was such an easy baby that Mary felt tricked into several more, all of whom seemed determined to balance out the ease she had first experienced with him. As he had grown up, though, Mary was increasingly worried about the way he talked about the Romans. Mary knew the injustice that their people faced every day, and the stories of Noah, Moses, and even Jesus' namesake Joshua had done to help escape from these kinds of evil. Mary had held many of the same beliefs when she was younger, even singing her own version of Hannah's prayer over Jesus as a lullaby. God will bring down the powerful and lift up the lowly ones. Now she worried that such ideas would get Jesus killed. The latest mess had come when Jesus announced he was going to be baptized, and he wanted her to come. She had a lot of work to do to prepare for her friend's daughter's wedding in Cana in just a couple of weeks, but Jesus rarely asked for her much from her, and despite her best intentions, she couldn't help but have a favorite kid. So she left behind Joseph to figure out the wedding gift, much to her chagrin. She listened to her cousin's son John preach about the future that was coming. He cried out, "Transform your mind! You were taught that Joshua entered these waters and purified himself to purify the land of our people's enemies. But I tell you, do not become like our enemies and destroy them as they have destroyed us. Cain will be avenged sevenfold, but Lamech 77-fold. Let us instead forgive 77-fold." And Mary heard Jesus add to himself, even 70 times sevenfold. Mary thought back to when Jesus was in her womb and she visited her cousin Elizabeth. Both of the babies in their womb seemed to dance inside them when they embraced, and now she watched as the two men embraced one another, as thinkers trying to find their way back to the promised land they were supposed to inhabit. As Jesus lowered into the water, Mary saw her son descend as the baby boy she had nursed. As he rose up covered in water, she saw him in a new light. He looked up to heaven, and as the light caught on his eyes, she thought he looked like the Son of God. As he came up to see her, he kissed her, the wet of the cold water dripping from her forehead with his gentle embrace. He whispered as he looked in her eyes as a new man, "Dad said to say hi." This is the reimagined word of the Lord. Thank God for our imaginations. In this story, we are called to transform our minds from what we expect to what God is now doing. The people want to be liberated from the war disguised as the Roman peace. So everyone but the righteous would need to be destroyed in the flood. The people want to be freed from slavery, so the righteous must cross over so that when the Romans come, they will be washed away by the sea. The people want their homeland, so the righteous must cross over the River Jordan to eliminate those already living there. These calls for violence rest on a simple and innately human intuition that violence demands violence. But John the Baptist, in this story, calls us to reimagine the purpose of these stories and remember our higher call. Instead of the flood being God's great judgment on humanity, we see the eradication of humanity, except for a very few, as the natural end result of our inhumanity toward humanity. Today, as more bombs fall on Gaza, the CO2 emissions from those planes, bombs, and military supply chain will cause the sea levels to rise in the state of Israel, forcing Israel's citizens to become climate refugees, just as they have forced Palestinian citizens to become refugees to claim their land. The effect of the violence hurts even those inflicting the pain, because even if there were some justice to what was being done, killing other human beings always dehumanizes the killer. The crossing of the Red Sea tells the same story, that dehumanizing others brings about your own destruction. Death brings death. The story of the flood tells us that this is a natural consequence of violence. Joshua's story of crossing the Jordan carries with it an implicit call to do to the other nations had attempted to do to Israel, bringing about their destruction. The book teaches the exclusion of others, the hierarchy of whom God has chosen, all rooted in this miracle of God allowing the people to cross over into the promised land. Yet Jesus is born from the line of Rahab, an outsider Joshua was supposed to eliminate. The book of Ruth is all about an outsider becoming chosen and bringing about salvation for the one she loved most. And Jesus' ministry reimagines the outside and the inside and declares that God, in all of these stories, was always on the side of the downtrodden and the left behind. It is up to us to go and seek God there with the broken. You see, baptism reverses that trend. Baptism invites us into a bodily experience where we feel differently, suddenly wet where we had been dry, suddenly cold where we had been warm, suddenly breathing again for the first time. It is both a remembrance of our births and a foretaste of our deaths, when we will go down below the surface and stay there until we are lifted up again at the name of the Lord. The first Sunday of Lent invites us into a physical change to remind us of our own deaths as inevitable and true parts of ourselves that are not to be avoided. And rather than trying to cling on to life by causing the death of others, we are called to death so that we might bring life to others. We are not called to suffer because suffering is some innate good. We are called to love, and love will include loss because love does not die. Or rather, the God who is love does not stay dead for long. We will all die, and that is good and true and holy thing. So we are called to remember our mortality now as an opportunity to experience life. Let us transform our minds from the way we have been. Let us die a death to the cycle of death so that it can be completed. And let us arise from the waters of baptism to begin a cycle of life that will transform everything it touches in the ever-growing kingdom of God. Shalom. You will join me in grabbing your water, dipping in a finger, and making the sign of cross on your forehead. Here, remember your baptism, the waters of life into which you were lowered, a foretaste of our death when we will be buried beneath the earth. And then as we rise, a remembrance of our life anew, a rebirth into what God is doing. Remember your baptism as the point in which we are entirely reoriented to what we are called to do next. And as you go, I hope that you will remember that you are God's beloved people. No matter who you are or who you love or what you believe, that God has called you to go and love others. Now go and remember your baptism that calls you to new life so that we might help to create a new life for all. Shalom.